name is Antonio Labrigetta. I am a full-time faculty member at St. Louis University in the psychology program. And first, I'd just like to welcome you to Sensation and Perception. I hope you enjoyed the course. We have recently updated it to a more interactive format, and I am involved with that course update. And one of the things that we thought was that, it would be nice to have for each module one lecture in which I go over some of the major themes that are found in the text and in the module materials. Maybe discuss concepts that might be kind of difficult for the traditionally that students find difficult in the course. Um, I have taught this class for a long time. It was actually, years ago. It was the first class actually that I taught as a graduate student back at University of South Florida when I was there earning my PhD. And this class can be a little daunting for some because it can be very academic. It can, in the sense that it's a lot of basic research. You're learning how the sensory system works. You're learning how the perceptual system works, and there's a lot of physiology. So don't be intimidated by the physiology. This is a good book. Goldstein has been doing this for years, and he does a good job of taking these complex concepts and making them more easily digestible. But certainly, if you're having problems, contact your instructor because that's what we're here for. But at any rate, let me show you what I wanted to talk about here, just for for a brief period here. Here's just some important themes. These themes here are themes that are discussed in chapter one, but will be present more or less throughout the course. So I want to go over the sensory perceptual process. I want to emphasize the point that perception is in fact a subjective experience. It's largely subjective. And I want to go over top-down versus bottom-up perspectives. And also, let me say before I jump into this that for all of these talks that I will have, one per module, make sure that you read, or at least go through the readings somewhat before you jump into this. I think it will help. It'll help provide needed context. So my assumption is that you necessarily haven't been studying, for hours and hours, but you've at least are somewhat familiar with the concepts. Once again, that's going to be important to provide needed context for these things. Okay, so let's jump into this. All right, so here you see, this is an important concept here, the perceptual process. Your author shows you the seven steps that he outlines of the sensory perceptual cognitive process, essentially. The ones in blue, this is the sensation part. All right, so one of the first things that you're going to be doing in here is kind of thinking about, well, what's sensation and what's perception. Um, Sensation really involves the gathering and transforming of environmental stimuli into neural patterns, essentially. We believe it's largely an unconscious process, meaning that at stages 1, 2, and 3, and 4, we're not consciously aware of that yet. It's only at stage 5 that we develop a conscious awareness of the universe around us. And that's what perception really is. So perception is more about a conscious awareness of things. Uh, Psychologists define perception as, the process by which the brain provides, or I should say the mind, organizes this sensory input and provides some meaning to it, an organization. And at this stage here, at stage 5, is when we actually have a conscious awareness of the world around us. And then here, stage 6, which closely works with stage 5, recognition and perception, this is more of a cognitive process in which we categorize things, name things, more meaning is elaborated on and so forth. And then, of course, finally, we have to engage in some sort of behavioral response. So this is sensation here, perception here, and then this is more of a cognition, although the two interact quite a bit. And then we have our response to things. Okay. Here we see an example of and for all the different sensory modalities, you have to have some kind of stimulus. And in the case of light, which really we spend most of the time in the class talking about the visual system, light is the stimulus for vision, and light is a form of electromagnetic radiation. And here you can see this visible light is. It's a narrow band of EM radiation that, as humans, our visual system is responsive to. So we can see it. We can perceive wavelengths of light from 400 to 700 nanometers. Incidentally, a nanometer is a billionth of a meter. It's very small. Anything outside of this is essentially invisible to us. We can infer its existence by other means, by various tools that we've created. So, for example, you cannot see an X-ray. You know this if you've had X-rays done at the dentist or whatever. You don't see them, but they are there. And our visual system, as well as the rest of our sensory system, defines what we can experience in the universe around us. It's our window to the universe, so that's very important. And this goes along with this notion that perception is, in fact, a subjective experience. Our, if you look at one of the things I like to talk about in class is that you have different creatures on the planet. You got your dogs, you got your cats, you've got bats, you've got elephants, all of these different kinds of animals. The sea creatures and whatnot all have vastly different sensory systems, so their experience of the world can be quite different. So I want to emphasize that point. But anyhow, once again, this is the stimulus for vision, which is light, which is a form of electromagnetic radiation. Now here you see that the initial steps in the perceptual process. It begins with a stimulus here. In this case, light is reflected off the tree. This is sunlight, presumably being reflected off the tree. It's in stage, you can see at stage 2 here, we have receptor organs whose job is to collect that stimuli. It collects it. In this case, it's going to collect light waves using the cornea and the lens. And this is explored more in chapter 2. But that light is focused, at least it tries to focus those light waves onto the retina back here. Incidentally, the image, by the way, is inverted, which is still somewhat of a mystery of why we have to have an inverted image, but that's what it is. What's kind of interesting here, and I like to point out, is that you literally have a copy of the visual world right here on the back of your eye. This image is sort of interesting. That image is essentially stimulating that image. It's forming an image on that retina, which has the rods and the cones, these receptors, which transform light into electrical impulses. So here you see that's the stimulus at her distal, by the way, just means something outside. It's far away. All right, so that'd be, in this case, the tree. The more proximal stimulus is going to be this image right here on the retina. So light is reflected and light is focused. That's really what your eyeball is doing. That's the main job of the eyeball, is to focus that light onto the retina. That's the main job. And then receptors are activated. Receptors are then activated. And what's very important, and all the sensory systems have to do this, is transform that sensory data, essentially, into electrical impulses. Okay, so that's the principle of transformation. All of the 5 senses have to do this, because ultimately, the way we perceive things, we have to have neural activity. Ultimately, all of this stimuli from the environment, whether it's light waves or sound waves or odors or whatnot, have to be converted into neural patterns so that we can perceive them. So we call this the principle of transformation. All of the sensory systems go through a process called transduction. And there's a great deal of that. Chapter 2 goes into this quite a bit, so you need to pay some attention to that. So we can see here sensory receptors, like in the case of the visual system, we're talking about rods and cones. These are cells specialized to respond to environmental energy. In this case, electromagnetic radiation. There are pigments, we call these visual pigments, on rods and cones that react to light. They actually change their shape when they are struck by light. And then the transduction process occurs, where we have changes of environmental stimuli to neural impulses. Once again, chapter 2 goes into this in some detail. You need to make sure you study that. And here you see an example. Again, we have the rods and the cones. These are once again found in your retina. Out here in this, what are called the outer segments here, there are these discs that you can see. Once again, chapter 2 goes into this more detail, but you have these discs and they will respond. The chemicals found here actually change their shape in response to light. And that process converts that energy into nerve impulses, right? So once again, you can see that. And you have to transform it. You have to transduce that. Think of it as like a translation process. If you don't know the language, you need a translator. And that's kind of what's going on here, basically. Then we have neural processing in the brain. So once that information is transformed by your retina, you have cells in the retina called ganglion cells, which are going to send off these signals to to the cortex, to lots of different parts of the brain, to the cortex, to parts of the brain that are called the thalamus. And this process is, we're going to go into more detail on this with chapter 3 in the text. But this maze of neurons, that's a good way to describe it. These are, there's just millions and millions of cells that are involved with visual processing. And this is shown here a little briefly. There you can see this is the cortex of the human brain. So we think, here's the occipital lobe, which is in the back of the head, right? So you got your occipital, parietal, frontal, and then there's the temporal. We have visual cells, essentially, or cells that are involved with the visual system pretty much all over the place. And here, the occipital lobe is almost exclusively devoted to vision. This is in the back of your head. At some point through this neural processing that is shown here, perception occurs. Now, exactly how we get from step 4, which is a sensory process, to step 5 is not entirely known. At some point, though, perception occurs, and once again, that is the conscious awareness of the world around you. Doesn't necessarily mean you know what you're looking at, but you're at least aware of something. Remember, the recognition is more of a cognitive process. But here you can see on the left, these are the rods and the cones again. There's a whole bunch of intricate, the retina is very intricate, has lots of different cell layers, different types of cells, which we'll go into more in chapters 2 in particular. And here you can see these are what are called bipolar cells, and we got, like in this case, that's a cone connected to this bipolar cell. And then down here, these are the ganglion cells, these ones that look sort of brown. These are basically neurons, and their signals, their output forms the optic nerve, which ultimately sends all this visual information to the various parts of the brain. So that's an important thing to know. Experience and action. Of course, we have to recognize the object, and then we can then respond to it. I mean, it's not enough to just simply be aware of things. Our perceptual system has to work with our cognitive systems, and in order so we can recognize things. So we know, is this something that we want to approach, or do we want to avoid it? Is this something pleasant, or should we, or is it something potentially dangerous? That's shown here in this picture. Here you see, here's a person. I see something, and you can see the tree here. This is the awareness that there's something out there. Doesn't mean you know what it is, but that's the perceptual part. Then our cognitive system interacts with our perceptual systems, and then well, it's an oak tree, okay, because you've seen these before, or maybe you've seen something similar, so you at least make the assumption that's what it is. And then here's the action. Do you want to get closer to this thing or walk away from it? I like to use the example here, like let's say if you're in your apartment or you're in your house, and maybe, there's something you see in the corner of your eye on the floor. Maybe there's some movement. And movement's a really good way to stimulate the visual system. Movement really attracts our attention. And at first you don't know what it is until you get a closer look. But is it something dangerous or not? And your past experiences, which I'm jumping into now with the top-down processing, what you know, your past experiences, your knowledge, your attitudes, even your emotions can affect your perceptual processing. So if you have a roach problem, for example, something unpleasant like that, you might really think you see a roach for an instant, and your heart might race, and then you look at it, you centralize it, you put it into the central part of your visual field, and it's just a leaf, and all of a sudden it looks a little different now, right? So I'm using that as an example because there are two different perspectives on perception in terms of how it actually occurs. And psychologists generally believe that both are happening. But we have some theories that emphasize bottom-up processing and some that emphasize top-down. And what I was just describing, here, the knowledge you have can affect perceptual processes. We call this top-down processing based on the perceiver's previous knowledge and cognitive factors. Knowledge-based processing. Typically, cognitive psychologists tend to emphasize this, and we will be exploring these in the course. Physiologists tend to emphasize what's called bottom-up processing, based on incoming data. These theories emphasize the notion that our visual system literally, from the ground up, constructs everything, almost line by line, the textures, the colors. I mean, when you think about objects, if you're looking around your house or your room or whatever, you look at any object in the room, it ultimately is composed of basic features that could be like added up to form the object. Just think of how an artist has to start literally from the ground up to create, let's say, a face. First, it's just lines, and it doesn't, makes no sense until you've added layer upon layer until you get to the face. That would be more like a bottom-up processing. But top-down is going to emphasize more of your knowledge and how that knowledge can influence the perceptual process. Uh, and we'll see that there are many theories. Many theories are presented in the text for perception of objects, which we'll get to later. Um, some emphasize the bottom up, some the top down, and then there are some that do a nice job of integrating both perspectives. Okay. So anyhow, that's what I wanted to do first. Make sure you study the first couple of chapters, and I wanted to make sure that you are aware of these major themes that we will be coming to again and again. So thank you, and have a great day.